We are down to the Final Four. This is Conference Championship weekend. Who is going to stamp their ticket to New Orleans? Johnny Sports Network here to provide you with my predictions for Conference Championship weekend. And before we get to the Conference Championship predictions, a few pieces of news from the NFL this week that I would like to discuss, and I will briefly discuss this before there's complaints in the comment section that I talk about nothing. Yesterday, or for those of you that are tuning in later this week, on Monday, the Bears announced they are hiring Ben Johnson to be their next head coach. And Ben Johnson, the top candidate for everyone participating in the head coaching search this season. The Bears, without a doubt, interviewed the most coaching candidates out of everyone, and they end up with Ben Johnson, the number one choice for everyone, as we've seen what Ben Johnson has done with the Lions in these past couple of seasons. And it was the kind of hire the Bears needed and they were desperate for. As if the Bears front office just lets Ben Johnson do his thing, give him time and patience, it's going to go smoothly. Despite the Bears having a 10-game losing streak at one point in the season, I have always felt like the Bears were an underrated team, as during those 10 games, there were a handful of them that they could have won and arguably should have won. The Bears have an underrated defense. They have a quarterback with a ton of potential in Caleb Williams. But the Bears took care of their number one priority in the offseason, and that was to hire an offensive genius for Caleb Williams. Their second priority, invest in the offensive line. The second piece of news, the NFL announced the officiating crew for the Super Bowl today. For those of you tuning in later this week on Tuesday, the referee for the Super Bowl will be Ron Tobert, and he was the referee for Super Bowl 56. I will mention it again next week, but Super Bowl 56 was a arguably controversial Super Bowl the way it ended. And he was also the referee for the Chiefs and Bengals AFC Championship game, where that was a very controversial game as well, and that is what really started the people starting to acknowledge the Chiefs' bias and favoritism was from that game. And the final piece of news, the Cowboys are interviewing their offensive coordinator, Brian Schottenheimer, to be their next head coach. And I have seen some Cowboys fans' reactions on the social medias, and they are not fans of that at all, and I don't blame them, because when you look at their offense from Kellen Moore to Brian Schottenheimer, it was really pretty much the same, and I would expect the 2025 Cowboys offense to look no different if they do hire Brian Schottenheimer to be their next head coach. And without further ado, let's get to the Conference Championship game predictions right here on the Johnny Sports Network. Commanders and Eagles in the NFC Championship game. The Commanders shocked the world last week, upsetting the Lions on the road. And the Lions, they were a juggernaut in the NFC. They were the favorites in the NFC nearly the entire season. And that was a game that was going back and forth for the first half, but then the second half, the Lions, they started to crumble. The Commanders' defense forced 5 turnovers in that game. And there are two big key components to the Commanders' success so far in the playoffs. And that is Jaden Daniels playing clean football and controlling the pace of the game. Jaden Daniels so far in the playoffs, he's completing just under 70% of his passes. 69.8% of his passes have been completed in the playoffs. 567 yards, 4 touchdown passes, and no interceptions. And the Commanders, they've provided an example of how the playoffs are an entirely different season, as they may have entered the playoffs starting to peak at the right time. A big talking point, at least for me, was the fact the Commanders were 1-4 against playoff teams this season, entering the playoffs, with the one win being against the Eagles when Jalen Hurts missed almost the entire game with a concussion. And I have seen a lot of people on social media talk about Jalen Hurts not playing to his full potential. And I did notice that, at least with him running the football, as he was just willing to slide. And I do get that he did sustain a concussion a handful of weeks ago. But it looked like he could have gone for a little more yardage than what he did. I saw about 4 or 5 of those kind of plays. But Jalen Hurts, also someone who has not turned the ball over in the playoffs. The two big key components for the Eagles in the playoffs so far has been their defense forcing turnovers and Saquon Barkley running the football. The Eagles defense, they forced turnovers against the Packers and the Rams, which were ultimately big difference makers in those two games. Saquon Barkley has 324 rushing yards so far in the playoffs. And in the two games against the Commanders in the regular season, Saquon Barkley had 296 rushing yards and 4 rushing touchdowns, averaging 5.4 yards per carry. In the first matchup between these two teams, it was on Thursday Night Football, and the Commanders, they were in that game nearly the entire game, and the Commanders were down by 2 points. It was 4th and 2. They were in field goal range, and instead of taking the field goal and going up by a point, the Commanders, they decided to go for it. They don't get it, and that is what changed the momentum of that game, as the Eagles had 20 points in the fourth quarter that night. And in the second game, that is where Jalen Hurts, he left the game due to a concussion, and Jaden Daniels, he had 5 touchdown passes in that game. But what I think a lot of people may be forgetting is the Eagles, they had the opportunity to win that game, but Devontae Smith, he dropped a pass, which would have been a first down, and it would have sealed the victory for the Eagles. But it was a drop, and that is how Jaden Daniels was able to lead that game-winning touchdown drive. But in this game, I do think that the Commanders, they will be in the game start to finish, just like they are more often than not against the Eagles. But I do think by a score of 27-20, the Eagles advance to the Super Bowl. I think Saquon Barkley, he has another big performance. And I think Cooper DeJean gets the game-winning interception to send the Eagles to New Orleans. Bills and Chiefs in the AFC Championship game. And we already know the narrative for this game. The Bills, they beat the Chiefs in the regular season, but in the playoffs, when it matters, the Chiefs always prevail. As Patrick Mahomes is 3-0 all-time against the Bills in the playoffs. In his career overall against the Bills, Patrick Mahomes has thrown 7 interceptions. Bills starting cornerback Christian Benford, he is in concussion protocol, and Taylor Rapp is also day-to-day. So injuries to keep an eye out for going into this game. While hearing the stat of Patrick Mahomes throwing 7 interceptions against the Bills throughout his career is something that does give you some optimism if you are the Bills. All 7 of those interceptions were in regular season matchups. In the playoffs, Patrick Mahomes, 918 passing yards, 8 touchdown passes, and no interceptions. I did say last week to count on Travis Kelce to get going in the playoffs. Last week, 7 catches, 117 yards, and a touchdown. And in last year's playoff matchup, Travis Kelce had 2 receiving touchdowns in that game. The Bills have the best turnover margin throughout the season. However, they're going to have to force turnovers if they want to win this game. And I just read off that Patrick Mahomes has not thrown an interception against the Bills in playoff matchups. The Chiefs did give up 88 rushing yards to Joe Mixon in the divisional round last week. So we'll see if James Cook is able to find his way past the Chiefs' run defense. Josh Allen has completed nearly 75% of his passes in the playoffs, but in the 2 playoff games, he hasn't exactly put up numbers that you really want to see out of someone like Josh Allen. But the theme of the playoffs so far, play clean football, and the chances of you winning the game is tremendously high. Last week, the Chiefs defense gave up 336 yards to the Texans. And I do think this game is going to go back and forth. But I don't think it's going to live up to the 2021 season divisional round matchup, where it was one of the best games that I've personally ever seen in the NFL. And a big talking point from last week's divisional matchup between the Texans and the Chiefs was the officiating, as there were multiple times where there was questionable calls that were voiced on social media. Will Anderson Jr., he said that we knew it was going to be us against the refs going into this game. And then at the 33rd Team FB on Twitter, they made a statement saying the Chiefs have actually gotten the fewest help from the refs since Mahomes became the Chiefs' starting quarterback. Since 2018, Kansas City ranks first in total penalty yards, 21st in total penalty margin, 32nd in offensive penalties committed EPA, 31st in defensive penalties committed EPA. However, what they are refusing to acknowledge is the timing and as far as the playoffs are concerned. And of course, I responded to them saying that the penalties against the Chiefs in the last 11 Chiefs playoff games, penalties against the Chiefs, a total of 37, and their opponents, a total of 66. And by the way, I am still waiting for them to respond back to me on that. But just like more often than not, when we see these two teams against each other, it is absolute cinema, and I expect nothing different on Sunday night. In fact, I am going to predict a fairly high-scoring game. I'm going to go 34-31. And the Chiefs, they advance to the Super Bowl with a Harrison Butker game-winning field goal. I am going to predict it's going to be tied at 31 very late in the game. It's going to be 3rd and long for the Chiefs. And then pass interference putting the Chiefs in field goal range. And Harrison Butker sends the Chiefs to New Orleans. And that will do it for my conference championship predictions. Comment your picks down below. Like, share, comment, and subscribe. Enjoy the games this week. I hope to see you back next week for my Super Bowl prediction. Until next time, Vegas is always watching.